Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Eric Mitchell, and I'm the Audrey Geisel University librarian. I'm so pleased you've joined us today as we celebrate the 125th anniversary of Leo Szilard's birth and as we discuss his legacy. UC San Diego Library's Special Collections and Archives is the home to the Leo Szilard papers, which document his scientific work and his efforts on behalf of arms control and world cooperation. The majority of these materials have been digitized and are openly available for scholars and researchers. And if you're interested in learning more or viewing the materials, you can visit our library website at lib.ucsd.edu/Szilard. Today, you're going to learn about Leo from his biographer, William Lanouette, geneticist Matthew Meselson. After their presentations, Feli Hartung will moderate the Q&A session. And so I'm really excited to have him joining us today. Now, throughout our presentation, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will, of course, do our best to answer as many questions as possible in the time we have. And so with that, please let me welcome William, Matthew, and Feli to the stage. And in the interest of time, I'll provide brief introductions to each of them before handing things over to William for his remarks. So William Lanouette is a writer and public policy analyst who is specialized in the intersection of science and politics. He was a staff member at Newsweek, the National Observer, and the National Journal, and was the Washington correspondent for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. In 1993, William published Genius in the Shadows, a biography of Leo Szilard, which was named a notable book of the year by the New York Times Book Review. In fact, William generously donated his research materials and interviews from this biography to our library, so just a deep appreciation to you, Bill. He holds a Bachelor in Arts from Fordham College and a Master's in Science, as well as a Ph.D. in Political Science from the London School of Economics. Matthew Meselson is the Thomas Dudley Cabot Professor in the Natural Sciences at Harvard University in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology. He has been a member of the Harvard faculty since 1960, where he conducts research in molecular genetics and evolution. Pioneer in his field, Matthew is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine, the Académie des Sciences, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the Royal Society. And as an award-winning scientist, Matthew has served as a consultant to numerous government agencies on the topic of biological and chemical weapons defense and arms control. He holds a Bachelor in Philosophy from the University of Chicago and a Doctor in Philosophy from the California Institute of Technology. And I'm also very honored to introduce our moderator today, Feli Hartung. Feli is a Ph.D. candidate in the History Department here at UC San Diego and is finishing her dissertation on the Energy Committee of Atomic Scientists, which Leo co-founded with Albert Einstein in the aftermath of World War II. Feli has conducted extensive research using the Leo Szilard and the Lanouette Szilard papers, and she has curated an exhibition celebrating Leo's 125th birthday, which is on display in Geisel Library. And so thank you, Feli, for that. So Bill, Matthew, and Feli, we really appreciate you being with us today, and I know we all look forward to learning from you. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Bill as our first speaker.
Thank you, Eric. I'll begin by sharing what some others have had to say about Leo Szilard. His sister-in-law, Francie Racker, said, Leo was not a person, he was a phenomenon. Biologist Francois Jacob called Leo an intellectual bumblebee for sharing so many fresh ideas, including negative feedback regulation of enzymes that won Jacob and Jacques Monod a Nobel Prize. James Watson, who decoded the DNA molecule with Francis Crick, said he loved being with Szilard because Leo got excited about something before it was true. Jonas Salk, who developed a polio vaccine, said for him, the impossible was possible. Impossible for others, but possible for him. Now, when you look at his life and see what actually accomplished, the things he did, no person in their right mind would do it, but yet he did. Here are a few highlights in his impossible life. Leo was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1898, and he was in an assimilated Jewish family. Even as a youngster, he believed his duty was to save the world. An artillery cadet in World War I, Leo hated military discipline and later said his hobby was baiting brass cats. Now, this would put him at odds with General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project that built the first A-bombs. The Manhattan Project succeeded thanks to 4 brilliant Hungarian physicists, all from Budapest: John von Neumann, Szilard, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wigner. They were called the Martians because they were superhumanly intelligent, and they spoke an unearthly language. Leo studied engineering in Budapest and physics in Berlin. There he befriended Albert Einstein, and they filed patents for an electromagnetic refrigerator pump that later cooled nuclear reactors. Leo's doctoral thesis laid the groundwork for what became cybernetics or information theory. A refugee from Hitler's Germany, Leo fled to London in 1933, and there he thought up the nuclear chain reaction. This he filed as a secret patent, fearing that German scientists would see its potential for a bomb. In 1939, Leo met Enrico Fermi at Columbia University, where they co-designed the world's first nuclear reactor. This prompted Leo to alert Einstein and to draft his letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning about German A-bomb research. After their reactor first worked in 1942, Leo recalled, "I shook hands with Fermi, and I said, I thought this day was go down as a black day in the history of mankind." And once Leo saw that Germany was defeated, he opposed dropping A-bombs on Japan and warned about a US-Soviet nuclear arms race. Science and society clashed for Leo in 1945, when he tried 4 ways to stop the bomb. First, in May, 2 weeks before the bomb was actually tested, he met Jimmy Burns, President Truman's new Secretary of State, to argue for an A-bomb demonstration. Burns told Leo that the bomb would make the Russians more manageable after the war, and he was eager to use it. Next, he urged J. Robert Oppenheimer to support post-war international controls on atomic energy. Third, in June, Leo helped draft a scientist's report to the Secretary of War, arguing to demonstrate the bomb before it leveled cities. And finally, in July, Leo circulated a petition to President Truman, signed by 155 Manhattan Project scientists, raising moral considerations and the A-bomb's post-war consequences. But General Groves saw to it that the petition didn't reach the White House until after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed. After the war, Leo and Einstein created the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists to try to educate the public and policymakers about the dangers of nuclear weapons. At the left in this picture, left of Einstein, is chemist Harold Urey. His papers are also here at UCSD, along with Szilard's and Salk's. Leo loved dreaming up institutions, and his legacy includes 5 that make our world better and safer today. In London in 1933, he helped found and run the Academic Assistance Council to support scholars escaping fascism. That now thrives as the Council for At-Risk Academics. In Chicago in 1945, he helped start the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to publicize scientific and political issues, a vital publication today. In 1957, he helped found the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, seeking US-Soviet agreements to halt the nuclear arms race. It was named for the town in Nova Scotia where they first met. Pugwash received the 1995 Nobel Peace Prize for its continuing strategies for nuclear disarmament. In 1960, Leo met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in New York and gained his assent to the idea of a Moscow-Washington hotline for the direct communication between Kremlin and White House in case of a nuclear crisis. And in Washington in 1962, Leo founded the Council for a Livable World, America's first political action committee to fund congressional candidates who support arms control. To alert the public, Leo wrote The Voice of the Dolphins, a political satire about ending the nuclear arms race. In this cartoon by Robert Grossman, Leo soaks in the tub, as he often does, and worries about the bomb, with the dolphins as a way, you find if you read it, to end the arms race. Leo turned to molecular biology after World War II, enriching the field as an intellectual bumblebee. Here he is with Niels Bohr at a biology conference in Copenhagen in 1959. And here he is with Jacques Monod in 1961. Leo worked with Matthew Meselson and Leslie Orgel in 1958. Here they are at a conference in Colorado. Orgel was a distinguished researcher at the Salk Institute. In 1957, Leo first met Jonas Salk at a biology conference at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and he proposed a new kind of research center. Leo helped found the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, and he convinced Jonas Salk to locate it here in San Diego. As an institute fellow, Leo began research on memory and on aging. But in May 1964, just a few months after he moved here, he died in his sleep of a heart attack at age 66. Now, Leo has been portrayed in several media that stress his social activism. There was a PBS Nova documentary, The Genius Behind the Bomb, by his niece, Helen Weiss. His petition to Truman is featured in the John Adams opera, Dr. Atomic. Leo and his future wife, Truda, star in the rock musical, Atomic, by Danny Gingiss. Leo's confrontation with Jimmy Burns is dramatized in Uranium Plus Peaches, a play I wrote with Peter Cook. And in a few seconds of the new 3-hour film Oppenheimer, Leo argues for his petition to Truman with J. Robert Oppenheimer, who tries to suppress it at his lab in Los Alamos. Each spring, the American Physical Society honors Leo's legacy with its Leo Szilard Lectureship Award for using physics to benefit society. Since 1974, recipients have included Matthew Meselson, Hans Bethe, Andrei Sakharov, Herbert York, James Hansen, and Carl Sagan. This year's award was to Laura Grego at the Union of Concerned Scientists for analyzing missile and space defense. And just this week, she lectured at MIT on the danger of nuclear weapons and what physicists can do about it. Leo was also honored for helping found the European Molecular Biology Organization in Heidelberg, Germany, where its library is named for him. And here at UCSD, Erwin and Joan Jacobs have endowed the Leo Szilard. A public health physician, Trudy preserved and published Leo's papers, and both his and hers are important collections here at the Geisel Library. I'll close with a little-known way Leo influenced the US-Soviet nuclear arms race. In 1947, he published My Trial as a War Criminal, a political satire in which he and other scientists and President Truman were all tried for creating and using A-bombs in World War II. In 1961, this story was read and translated by the Soviet H-bomb physicist Viktor Adamski, and he shared it with his colleague Andrei Sakharov. Leo's message inspired Sakharov to oppose nuclear weapons tests and to crusade for arms control, earning him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975. That concludes my remarks. Now I'm pleased to welcome my colleague, Professor Matthew Meselson, to continue our conversation about science in the public interest.
Thank you, Bill. So because Leo loved being with young people, I met him in 1947 at the University of Chicago. At that time, students in the physics department were wondering whether they should continue in physics. Some of them were wondering because there were so many others in the physics department and the competition was very stiff. Others were concerned with the fact that nuclear weapons had come out of nuclear physics and they felt inhibited by that. And still others might have been inspired by Erwin Schrödinger's book, What is Life? Which, because he was asking this question, made it more fashionable for physicists to become interested in biology. In any case, here was Leo at this time, 1947, at the University of Chicago, certainly a physicist, but he had by then already become a biologist. He had a laboratory where he worked with his young colleague, Aaron Novick, in the basement of an abandoned synagogue near Lake Michigan, which belonged to the University of Chicago by then. So Leo was an example of a physicist who had become a biologist. And so young people at Chicago who were wondering what to do with their lives were attracted to Leo. And by chance, I happen to know two of those young people, Nina Byers, who became a professor of physics at UCLA, and Neville Simons, who became a biologist at the University of Sussex in England. So I didn't know Leo well at that time, but I attended the little coffee clutches where this subject of what one should do with one's life. I had already by then myself decided to try to apply physics and chemistry to biology. Leo did a number of important things as a biologist. He and Aaron Novick invented a machine called a chemostat, which is a device for keeping bacteria growing in a steady state. And I just looked up to see how many papers in science have cited the chemostat, and it's 6,126 as of today. So that invention has had considerable use. Leo also became interested in the theory of aging. Although the theory that he proposed was wrong, it must be said that we still do not know what drives the aging process. And Leo also wrote a paper, but he never published it, which I think is a lovely idea, starting with the idea that during the evolution of human beings, it's important that parents can recognize their own children. Perhaps in a little community, lots of children, lots of adults, unless you had a way to recognize your child, you couldn't benefit the survival of your own genes, and therefore you would lose out on the evolutionary advantage of those who could recognize. So anyway, Leo's idea was that the features of the face by which you might recognize your child are determined by genes which are closely linked together, so they don't get mixed up, so that you can have some degree of inheritance of the same looking face generation after generation. And so he's never published this. It's too bad, because these days we could test that idea to find out if genes which affect facial structure are closely linked on the same chromosome. So considerably later, Leo created, as Bill has said, the Council for a Livable World in 1962. The idea of the council was, Leo's idea was that although each state gets the same number of senators, 2, and since the Senate deals with treaty ratification, the House does not, that it might be that a little bit of money in a small state could make more likely the election of a senator who was interested in nuclear arms control. So the idea was a little bit of money in the right place might have an outsized influence. So he created the Council for a Livable World. He put me on the board of directors. The council still exists, and the way it operates is it collects money from its supporters in checks made out to candidates for the Senate and in some cases for the House. But it doesn't pass these checks on as individual pieces of paper. It gathers them into a bundle, and then someone from the council delivers the bundle to the campaign of that senator. And that ensures that the council gets some influence because their contributions are much greater than the contribution of any one individual. And also, in Leo's time, the council, by gaining this entree with the senators who it benefited, would provide lectures and lunches to senators, lectures about nuclear arms control and related subjects. In 1960, Leo was in the hospital with bladder cancer, of which he was cured by a procedure of multiple beam irradiation, which he devised himself, when he heard that Khrushchev was coming to the United Nations. Leo had an idea that he wanted to convince Khrushchev about. It was called the Angels Project, and he had another idea, the idea of the hotline, to which Bill has already referred. And he wanted to see Khrushchev, so he called Dobrynin, the permanent representative of the Soviet Union to the United Nations at that time, and said he wanted to see the secretary, the general secretary of the Communist Party, Khrushchev. And Dobrynin said, okay, 5 minutes. And Leo said, no, I want to see him for at least an hour. And Dobrynin said, that's impossible. And so Leo said, I don't know his exact words, of course, but he said, forget it. Now Khrushchev comes to New York, and Dobrynin calls Leo, he's still in the hospital, and says, well, the chairman would like to see you. And now, without quibbling about how many minutes it would be, Leo picked up a gift in the gift shop of the Memorial Hospital and went over to the Soviet embassy, Soviet consulate, and met with Khrushchev. Now, what happened there, of course, I wasn't there, but a friend of mine has a document that Leo wrote. I have that document somewhere, describing something interesting that happened. Leo, in his pocket, had a gift, which he presented to Khrushchev and said, this was a very special razor, which he used every morning for shaving. And he had it, according to the memo that I've read, the little box with the Schick injector razor. And then Leo reached into another pocket and took out another little box and said, but this razor requires special blades. You need to replace the blade every once in a while. These are the blades for 6 months, and I'm giving them to you under one condition: no nuclear war. To which, according to what Leo told my friend Maury Fox, Khrushchev said, "Don't worry, Szilard. When nuclear war starts, we stop shaving." So, and then after that meeting, Khrushchev sent Leo a great case of Buzhum, which is a special Russian mineral water. So, some years after that, after Jonas Salk had devised the Salk vaccine against polio, Salk wanted to create an institute for molecular biology in Pittsburgh. Leo had met Jonas in New York and was convinced that really good scientists wouldn't want to easily go to Pittsburgh, that they should go to some very beautiful place like La Jolla on the coast of California, just above San Diego. And at that time, there was a long tract of land owned by one man, and he was interested in developing it. The University of California at San Diego was one of those outcomes. And Leo proposed to Jonas that they approach this real estate man with the idea that he might make a plot of land available at a reasonable price to create an institute. And that happened, and the Salk Institute was born. There had to be a lot of planning, and all this planning was done at the Hotel Carlyle in New York over vast amounts of bagels and lox and coffee and cream cheese. Leo loved food, any kind of food. I'll come to that in a minute. And I attended those meetings. I was supposed to go to the Salk Institute, but in the end, I decided to go to Harvard, even though Leo Kahn had helped started to design a laboratory for me. Maybe I would have been in that beautiful place. So it was created, and Leo became a fellow there. And he, with his wife Trudy, by 1964, were living in the Del Charro, in a little bungalow of the Motel Del Charro. And on May 28th, 1964, I was having dinner there at the Del Charro with Leo and Trudy. We were watching television. I reluctantly say that my memory is we were watching Bob Hope. Maybe that's not true, but there was a tray of delicious things that had been prepared, and Leo was devouring everything. And then at the end of that, it's getting pretty late, I drove back up to Los Angeles, where I was staying with my parents. And that morning, my mother told me that she had heard on the radio that Leo had died that night. So now Leo had done a lot of things to encourage other biologists. One of them came from a discovery he and a colleague made, that if you add the end product of an enzymatic chain of reactions, it inhibits the reactions. That makes sense. Once you've got a lot of a product, you don't need any more. And the way it does it is by inhibiting the activity of the first enzyme in the chain. It's called end product inhibition. And this was one of the things that began the whole science of allostery, how small molecules interact with proteins to change their shape and their function for certain biological processes. So Leo, I think, can be credited with the beginning of that, as well as the chemostat, something else called photo reactivation. Ultraviolet light damages DNA, but ordinary blue light fixes up the damage. Leo and a colleague discovered that. I could go on, but the main contribution of Leo, of course, the main effect he's had on the world, is what Bill talked about. He was the one who very early, I think 1937, saw the possibility of nuclear engines and nuclear bombs. And as Bill has described, the bomb would have been developed later if it hadn't been for Leo. Maybe never used, maybe Nagasaki and Hiroshima would be there today. It would be as they were today. So I think I've used up most of my time. To summarize, I'd say Leo was the warmest of human beings, the most optimistic about what's possible for our species, and ingenious in finding ways to make the likelihood of that good outcome actually happen.
Thank you so much for both of your presentations, and we really appreciate your input and your insights. We would now like to transition over to the Q&A, and we encourage everyone in the audience to submit a couple of questions. It can go to any of those two speakers or to both of them. You may also mark this on the question if you like. I'm going to start us off with the very first one. And that actually picks up with what Matthew said at the very end. So we heard so much about Leo's accomplishments and about what he has accomplished during his life and what his legacy was. So particularly we heard about Leo's contribution to the Manhattan Project. And we know that Leo's idea of creating a nuclear chain reaction was instrumental in building the atomic bomb. So why is it that Christopher Nolan made a film on Oppenheimer in which Leo is only referenced as an unimportant side figure? Bill actually had one of those screenshots on one of his slides where you can see just a very bit, just a snipping of the Szilard figure popping up in the film. So, in other words, how is it that Leo's contribution to the building of the bomb and his legacy and his ideas for peace are actually almost forgotten?
Well, I think one reason is that Leo liked baiting brass hats. And he so annoyed General Groves during the Manhattan Project that Groves tried to have him jailed during the war. When that didn't succeed, he made sure that Leo stayed in Chicago, away from Los Alamos, where all the action of that film happens to take place. The movie made passing references to the Einstein letter and briefly showed the Fermi-Szilard reactor, but mostly it was about constructing the bomb at Los Alamos. Right after Hiroshima, Groves classified Leo's petition, and it wasn't declassified and published until the 1960s. So people really didn't know what he had tried to do during the war. Also, after the war, Groves had Szilard secretly fired from the government work in 1946. And except for some consulting he did out here for General Atomics, he really quit physics and took up his earlier interest in molecular biology.
Awesome, thank you so much. We also have another question by Drew Senier, who asks, is it true that the 4 Hungarian Martians that you mentioned, Bill, had the same math teacher in Budapest? Do you know that?
No, they couldn't have. Leo Szilard lived a couple of doors from the Episcopal Gymnasium where John von Neumann and Eugene Wigner studied, and they had a famous math teacher who was credited with the brilliance of math that von Neumann is known for. Edward Teller went to a different school called Minta, and Leo Szilard went to a real school, which was something where he started to study engineering. So 2 of them went to the same school and had a famous math teacher. Leo once said that the reason that Hungarian physicists were so brilliant was that at that time, the teaching of physics was just terrible. And he said we had to make up our own theories.
Nice. We have another question that moves us to a later period of Szilard's life. We actually have two questions that are kind of related. One is, did Leo Szilard ever go to Los Alamos while the bomb was being constructed, or did he stay in Chicago? This question comes from John Isaacs. And then related to this is also to the lab work, basically, by Emma Jablonski. She asks, did Leo Szilard have any relationship with the Lawrence Livermore National Labs?
Well, Leo was kept from Los Alamos by General Groves, and he, in fact, predicted, I think this was in the Oppenheimer movie, that all these people are going to go there and go crazy, locked up on the Mesa. But he did go, finally, he went to Los Alamos in the 1950s, and he went there to propose that it become a biology study center, not a place to make nuclear weapons. And the second question was?
The second question was related to the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories.
Yes.
What was his connection to them?
No, he had no connection. The Livermore lab was really under the influence of Edward Teller and his concerns about making the hydrogen bomb. And Leo and Teller argued very strongly, again, about the bomb. Leo didn't want it, and Teller seemed to love it. And so it was the Livermore lab where where Teller actually did work for the H-bomb. So Leo had no connection with that.
Thank you. Awesome. Let's bring Matthew back into the conversation. I have one more question that is related to another fellow scientist, Hans Bethe. And Hans Bethe said at some point that Szilard was very energetic in his engagement for peace, but very energetic in all kinds of things that he did. And so he formulated this in a type of beam me up, Scotty. So what he said was, we were convinced that he could be at two places at the same time. You know that? Well, people have said he was incredibly energetic. At the time, the idea was very much in the foreground of making particles and annihilating particles. And so we said a joke where Szilard is obviously a person who can be annihilated easily at one place and then almost at the same time appear at another place, being recreated. Is that something that speaks to your experience as well?
Leo traveled around a lot, and he would pop into your laboratory without announcing himself. And he would stay, ask what you were doing, give you his ideas about it, and leave. So in that sense, he was very mobile.
The story that Hans Bethe had in mind was that he knew Leo in the 1930s when Leo was racing all over Europe to try to organize the Academic Assistance Council. And he said he thought that, well, maybe he could be in two places at once. Well, it turned out Leo is in two places at once, because for the centenary of his birth, the Hungarians wanted to have Leo's ashes, which were at that point here in San Diego. And some negotiations followed, and half of Leo's ashes went to Budapest, to the Kerepesi Cemetery. The other half went to Ithaca, New York, to the family grave of Trudy Weiss and her family. So Leo now really is in two places at once.
That's very true, yeah, literally. We have two questions that are related in the sense of asking about Leo Szilard's legacy, the title of this webinar. So Laura Gregor asks, what did Szilard consider his greatest accomplishment? And Shaba Olash chimes in and says, I want to propose a speculative question. What do you, as experts, think Szilard would most likely to be remembered by? So basically thinking about what he might want us to remember of him.
Matt, do you want to try that first?
Well, clearly the most consequential thing he did was to propose the idea of a nuclear chain reaction at the time he did, because if he had that idea later, or if he had never had that idea, the bombing of the two cities in Japan would not have occurred. And that would have been a major event in history, or a major non-event in history. So in terms of positive contributions, I would say that Leo's example has caused a very large number of people to try to not only emulate him, but to make his ideas succeed. The European Molecular Biology Organization was Leo's idea. The Salk Institute, where it is now, was Leo's idea. So those two things on the nature of scientific or creative contributions, certainly very big. And maybe I forgot some that Bill knows.
Well, there is a legacy of Leo, which comes, in fact, from his 10 Commandments. He was impatient with the original 10 Commandments and decided to write his own. And the second commandment speaks, I think, to his life and what he should be remembered for. The second commandment is, let your acts be directed toward a worthy goal, but do not ask if they will reach it. They are to be models and examples, not means to an end. And I think with the Leo Szilard Lectureship Award, you see dozens of scientists who have followed his example with concern about the effects on society of science.
Absolutely. More
Yes.
than anyone else I can think of in the whole assembly of physicists and other scientists, I guess Leo, yeah, fits that description. Yeah.
What he's not remembered for are some ideas he had that he never pursued. One was the cyclotron, which Edward Lorenz ended up developing. Another was the electron microscope. And the third was, how do you describe it? Well, let me pass on that. But those two, I think, were things that he thought up and then never really pursued.
Wasn't the third the microfilm? Is that the third one?
The one?
The microfilm that he tried to patent that then was already been patented?
That was something, yeah. He would think of so many things. I remember Isidore Rabi at Columbia talking about Leo when he came there in 1939, and he would soak in his bathtub until noon, and then he would go over to the campus, and he would go in and he would talk and say, "Oh, you ought to do this, you ought to do that, you ought to." And Rabi finally said, "Leo, we can't take it anymore. We can't do everything you want to do." He was just a fount of ideas.
Speaking of Rabi, we also have another question, or a couple of questions that are related to the relationship of Szilard with other people related to the Manhattan Project. I'm going to start with John Isaac's question on, didn't Szilard and Teller remain friends despite very different views about the H-bomb? And Teller helped to destroy J. Robert Oppenheimer?
Yes, that's an interesting, in my book, there is a chapter on Teller and Oppenheimer, and Szilard was sort of stuck in the middle between them. Teller and Szilard were good friends all their lives, but when it came to nuclear weapons, they were on opposite poles. They had nationally televised debates about this, and they really personified two different attitudes about arms control. During the Oppenheimer hearing, Szilard came down from New York, where he lived, to Washington to try to find Teller and to try to talk him out of testifying against Oppenheimer. And he went around in Washington. It turned out Teller was locked up with his lawyers. And he came back to the hotel and he told his wife, Trudy, he said, I've got to find Teller because if I don't, I'll have to defend Oppenheimer the rest of my life. Now, for various reasons, he didn't like Oppenheimer. He did finally appreciate that Oppenheimer came to oppose nuclear weapons, but he generally thought that Oppenheimer had taken on himself the role of speaking for the scientists and said, oh, it's not your business. And for that reason, Oppenheimer never circulated Szilard's petition to Truman at Los Alamos. But the two of them, Teller and Oppenheimer, Teller and Szilard were friends all their lives. And if you see interviews of Teller after Szilard's death, it's quite clear that he was very fond of Leo.
Right. Related to this, about the strategy that Leo and Oppenheimer employed in making change or creating change, Ash Yogalekar is asking, Leo was clearly a consummate outsider of sorts, Oppenheimer the consummate insider. Both in their own way try to stem nuclear proliferation. What do you think are the pros and cons of both approaches?
Matt, do you want to try that? I know you know about Leo's political activities.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So Ash is asking about the consummate outsider of sorts. Being someone who's not within the realm of politics, or I would also understand this perhaps in the context of transitioning from physics to biology.
Now, there are two kinds of outsiders. There's the kind who's really an outsider who maybe tries to influence events by marching or signing a petition. That's not the kind of outsider Leo was. Leo went directly to Einstein. Leo tried to get directly to to Truman. Leo was done on the inside of things. It's just that often the person he wanted to get to wouldn't see him, but often the person he wanted to get to did see him. The sense in which Leo was outside was that his thinking was different from and ahead of the dominant thinking of the time. But he wasn't an outsider. He was intimately involved with the events of his day and intimately involved with trying to change things.
Leo
always wanted to go directly to the top.
Exactly. Leo loved dreaming up things and then taking them to people with power and having them carry on.
Exactly.
He tried in so many ways. When the Japanese attacked Shanghai in the 30s, Leo was living in London, and he went to all the Nobel laureates he knew in London, and he had met a number by then, and tried to get a petition of Nobel laureates to protest against the Japanese invasion. He wrote the letter to President Roosevelt, and he had Einstein write a second letter to Roosevelt in 1945 to talk about where he wanted to talk to the president about post-war control of nuclear weapons. And after the war, he wrote a letter to Stalin, an open letter to Stalin, and he wanted the US and the Soviet leaders to do broadcasts to each other's populations. And then, of course, through his pugwash friends, he got to meet Nikita Khrushchev in 1960 when Khrushchev came to the UN. So he wasn't shy about going right to the top with his ideas. And that's probably another reason he's not remembered, because if he succeeded, then the person who acted got all the credit.
Great. I would also like to acknowledge, first of all, that we have Richard Garvin here in the audience, who says that he knew Leo from Chicago from 1947 or so. Yes, Matthew is waving. And Dr. Garvin is sharing that he became a graduate student in physics, a student of Fermi, and received his Ph.D. in physics from Fermi, and became a summer consultant with Fermi at Los Alamos with Fermi. Shared a small office with Fermi where I worked mostly on nuclear weapons, and saw Leo a couple of times at CERN in Geneva. Also acknowledges that he learned a lot from your book, Bill, which I think many of us can subscribe to. Bringing us back into the realm of nuclear proliferation, we have one question from Andy Nedermeyer, who asks, with the enormous proliferation of nuclear weapons, which my dad made some contribution to, what might Leo's idea be of putting the nuclear genie back into the bottle?
Want to try that, Matt?
I don't know of any, maybe he did have a detailed plan, but I don't know of a detailed plan that Leo had. It would have involved declarations and destruction or deactivation of weapons, but I could be wrong, but I don't think Leo got down into that level of detail.
Well, in 1946, he helped draft the Atchison-Lilienthal proposal, which was to try to create out of the new UN, which was just formed, an international atomic energy agency, and put all the nuclear materials and all the nuclear technology under one authority. And that did not succeed, but that was, I think, his first effort. In fact, Leo, he didn't want to use the bomb offensively. He thought it was a defensive weapon against Germany. But there was a brief time in 1944 when he thought the only way that the world can be shocked into controlling nuclear weapons with the international regime that's necessary is to actually use it. It turned out to be something that he very quickly changed his mind on. But the notion was you have to shock the world enough to create a one world government or a one world atomic structure. And that was what he tried to do. And the Pugwash conferences tried to work for international control. So that was his big effort. He knew that the bombs are going to be there. He knew that the material and the technology would be there, but it was international control that he hoped would keep it from spreading as a weapon.
I know an anecdote which, if true, is amusing. There was a Pugwash meeting at which discussion was on the number of tests that could be allowed under an agreement that restricted the number of nuclear tests. And there was a disagreement that wasn't very big between the Americans at the Pugwash meeting, I think it was in Vermont, and the Russians. And the proposal had been made, and the question was, by the American side, and the question was, would the Russians accept it? And I was not there, but what I was told is that at some point, you heard the word "da" in the room, which would, of course, break the deadlock. And then people looked around, and it was Leo.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing. Both of those answers are very something that I guess we all are thinking about when it comes to nuclear proliferation. I would also like to acknowledge that we have Leo's niece here in the audience, Helen Weiss, who asked the question to the both of you. And she would like to know, are there scientists or engineers corresponding with you who are currently using Szilard's research or inventions? And if so, do you know of anything that you could describe about their work?
I've known about two. One is that Szilard worked on the intellectual problem of Maxwell's demon, which has to do with thermodynamics, and that there is a physicist at the University of Texas, Mark Raisin, who is in fact using the Maxwell's demon concept to isolate molecules and even individual atoms. Also, other people have written, there's a group at Oxford that has written about Leo's early ideas about information theory. And they're advancing his concepts, which he had in his doctoral thesis and in a later paper, which they say they have concluded was very foresighted on his part. Those are two I know about in Texas and Oxford.
Awesome.
No, I don't know of any.
We have one more question related more to Matthew, I guess, about your PhD advisor, Linus Pauling. So what kind of interactions did Leo have with Linus Pauling, who received the Nobel Prize for his work on nuclear disarmament?
I really don't know. Well, Linus received the Nobel Prize regarding his opposition to testing in the atmosphere. I think that's right, more than for disarmament. I don't know of any interaction. I'm sure there was, but I don't know.
Perhaps I can chime in just to say that the two of them were together in the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists. So they did have some sort of a background in terms of the peace activism that they did together. More on a note of family versus science, we have one question by Drew Senier, who asks, was Leo a good family man or just consumed by science?
Leo said he was always a bachelor, although he did eventually marry someone he loved very much. Leo also said that the reason he was a good scientist is that he was a good child, and he thought young kids had brilliant insights that you lose as you learn more formally. Leo had no kids of his own, but he loved being with kids and writing stories for them. And there are several very touching pictures of Leo sitting on a couch reading to various youngsters. I think, I'm not sure what it would have been like to be Leo Szilard's son. Nobody had that experience, but he certainly loved children. And in fact, you know, the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. Leo had another take on that. He said, honor children. Listen reverently to their words and speak to them with infinite love. That's his commandment.
All right. Thank you so much. We're nearing the end of our session already. And we would like to, first of all, apologize for the questions that we can't get to today, but we very much appreciate all of your input. Before we part, we would like to extend a couple of thank yous for everyone who made this gathering possible and this conversation so lively. We would like to, of course, thank Bill Lanouette here for the idea of putting this panel together. And then we would thank both of you, Matthew and Bill, for sharing your knowledge about Leo Szilard and for letting us into your personal experience with him, and just thereby helping us understand Leo better. We would also like to thank the team at the library who made the webinar possible. Among them is Jen Cormier, who organized and produced the show, Eric Mitchell, who we saw earlier and who guided us through the session, and Linda Klassen, the Director of Special Collections, who made our gathering possible. Last but not least, we would also like to thank all of you in the audience who helped us create a lively discussion through your engaging questions. And we thank you for participating in this event, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your evening.